Hi, good afternoon. Not the biggest turnout I had hoped for today, so I don't have to go through a very long introduction potentially, but I'm happy to introduce Dr. Leo Blanken from the Naval Postgraduate School and his counterpart, Dr. Jason Lepore from CalPoly Economics Department. I've worked with them for several years now. Very excited for this.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks to McCoy and Andrea and Kelly who helped help us get out here. Thanks to IDA for hosting us, and thanks to you all for spending the afternoon with us. First, I want to say that the views expressed today are our own and do not reflect position or policy of the United States government or the DoD or whatever. So today, as McCoy pointed out, I'm a political scientist, Jason's an economist. So what we're going to be looking at is problems around defense planning, and as you'll immediately see, we'll be looking at them from a more social scientific perspective than a lot of treatments. So rethinking defense planning, are we investing in capabilities or security? And this is something that we want to unpack today. So I want to start with a story. The $1 trillion noisemaker. So I put up a reference to an incident that took place in eastern Afghanistan in late 2009, the Battle of Bala Murghab. And this was an unfortunate incident where a U.S. service member drowned in a river, and it took about 12 to 14 hours for forces to locate his body to bring it home. And so at this location, there were elements of the 82nd Airborne. There was a MARSOT, Marine Special Operations Team, Italian ISAF partner forces, and a large contingent of ANA, Afghan National Army. And they were trying to find the body of this American service member who had drowned in a river. While this was going on, a couple of Taliban opened fire on these forces from a farmhouse right next to where they were working. And for about 12 hours, a couple of Taliban with small arms, like AK-47s, shot at these US and Allied forces trying to recover this body. And they killed several ANA soldiers and translators, and they wounded several Americans. Now, this is puzzling because the US forces operating at Bala Murghab were more than capable of confronting, dislodging, destroying these Taliban fighters who were shooting at them for over 12 hours. So they had more than enough forces. They had armored vehicles with, crew-served weapons on them that could have destroyed this building or assaulted it. They also had a MARSOT JTAC, Joint Terminal Air Controller, who had a stack of A-10 and F-16 aircraft stacked over the location for 12 hours. Any of those aircraft could have immediately destroyed this building. But because of choices that were made, risk aversion among decision makers on that day, nothing was done to dislodge or destroy these handful of Taliban shooting AK-47s, which were inflicting casualties on allies and partners. And what they ended up doing, the only thing they did to these Taliban is the MARSOT JTAC called in the F-16s to fly low over the buildings, to use the sound of their engines, which were so loud, to try to temporarily disorient the Taliban. So in essence, easily $1 trillion of American taxpayer dollars to buy these weapons, train these American forces, these pilots, build F-16s, build all these forces, project them to Afghanistan and sustain them in Afghanistan. This was easily $1 trillion investment if you take in all of these things that took to project those forces to eastern Afghanistan, and they ended up becoming $1 trillion noisemaker, which is puzzling in a lot of ways. Number one, you could ask yourself, did those weapon systems, were they not good? Did they not operate well? The M4s that the soldiers had, the Gatling guns mounted on the armored vehicles, the F-16s, did those weapons not perform adequately? No, we know they're actually really good. Were American forces poorly trained? Do we have a poorly developed and trained military? I don't think so. The third thing is you could say, well, we went to Afghanistan with the wrong military, right? We planned, these were not the right weapons and forces to fight the Taliban with. They were just the wrong array of forces and capabilities to deal with the Taliban. But this was in the fall of 2009. This was 8 years after the beginning of the conflict in Afghanistan. That's twice as long as World War II. Should be more than enough time for American forces to adapt, to take out a handful of dudes with AK-47s in a farmhouse. And instead, these couple dudes paralyzed the US military for 12 hours. This is an interesting puzzle, and this is what we want to look at today. So the United States makes enormous investment in seemingly impressive military forces that often fail to defeat or coerce much weaker adversaries. And so what we want to propose today, and we're going to build some arguments today about reframing this type of planning within its real context, moving away from simply looking at battlefield capabilities in the search to secure, and investing for national security, investing for security for the national welfare. And to do so, we're going to focus on the incentive structures that are created for actors throughout the national security enterprise. So those are the two things that we're going to build arguments around today to try to address this slippage or this gap between seemingly impressive American military forces and the outcomes that they can actually create. So this is just an outline. We're going to introduce something that we call the feasible production framework, a framework for looking at the feasible production of security versus planning for battlefield capabilities. And to do so, we're going to talk about these 4 stages of production, from budgeting to planning to coercing with forces to actual warfighting. So we're going to talk about the entire framework, and then we're going to focus on 2 stages of the framework. One is the culminating stage, the warfighting stage, where we're really going to unpack incentives for actors. And then the second one we're going to look at is planning, because we thought that would be most relevant for the audience today. Just a little bit of background. Jason and I worked with McCoy when? 10 years ago? A long time ago. We worked with McCoy at one of her previous jobs over a decade ago, and worked on a little project with her previous organization, which actually got us thinking about these issues. And Jason and I have been kicking around elements for this for a long time. But what we're trying to do now is write a book on it, which sounds a lot easier than it is. And so we're trying to get the story. That doesn't sound we're trying to get the story straight. And so, as we go along, if we're telling the story well or poorly, or there's missing pieces, you don't understand something, we're a small group here. Please jump in, and we really relish discussion, et cetera, along the way. Yeah.
So just as a preview, are you guys conventional or nuclear or both?
Just conventional. Okay. Right. And we do have arguments based around nuclear stuff as an extreme case, but we even unpacked it enough to feel comfortable talking about it. So, yep. So let's talk about our overall argument, what we call the feasible production framework. And so want to give just a little background on where we see, and once again, neither of us are practitioners of this, but where we see from our reading the trajectory of how the U.S. thinks about building weapons and forces for national security, going back to World War II. So a lot of the foundational work that has structured how the Pentagon and other elements of the DoD create weapons and forces goes back to post-World War II, the reorganization of the U.S. national security apparatus in 1947, and then largely the use of managerial economics tools to enable OSD to rationalize planning and impose this rational planning over the uniformed services. So moving from what had previously been much more the story of handing slices of the pie to the Army or the Navy and letting them do what they want, having OSD synchronize investments across the services for a national strategy, and also make sure there's not too many gaps or redundancies between the services, create coherence. So impose coherence and efficiency on the national security enterprise. And this is a quote from the person that we largely identify, and you guys probably know through PPBE, et cetera. Robert McNamara himself as an economist, and as sort of leading the charge of whiz kids from Rand to impose this on the U.S. national security apparatus, saying, "My team and I were determined to guide the department in such a way as to achieve the objective the president had set: security for the nation at the lowest possible cost." Right. So managerial economics tools to create a notion of defense, rational defense spending that can basically be characterized as capabilities per dollar. And this occurred, you can put yourself in the position of these early Cold War Rand, sort of pioneering giants at Rand. These folks had experience. The United States had just fought World War II, this existential war against the Axis powers, and was now facing a peer adversary, this global peer adversary with significantly divergent views about the way the international system should be run, the Soviet Union. But this actually ended up being a big benefit for early defense planners because they had a really transparent and grave adversary to do planning against. So the Soviet forces provided a well-understood, slowly advancing focal point for long-range planning. The Soviets were in many ways a mirror image, right? Strategic nuclear forces, a lot of similar conventional forces. We knew what they wanted to do, and we knew how to plan against it. All else was considered lesser included. The idea was that if the US military was prepared to fend off a large threat, the Soviet military, then it was certainly equipped to defeat smaller scale threats. So this term, like lesser included, is going to become really problematic for us, which means if you can create a military that can beat a big opponent, can you assume that it can beat a smaller opponent? And this is going to be a real puzzler, a real bugaboo for us for the rest of the talk, this notion of lesser included. And we can talk about these early Rand pioneers, especially these two guys. Hitch and McKean write a book on defense economics in the late 60s, the basis of which is still largely baked into the cake of thinking about defense economics and defense planning. So people like Hitch, McKean, Quaid, using managerial economics tools, operations research systems analysis tool for like considering alternatives for investment, end up baking into the cake a lot of the intellectual architecture that still undergirds a lot of defense planning, because a lot of it also gets baked into the PPBE system. And so what we're really going to focus on here is these models, either implicitly or explicitly, use neoclassical economics assumption that black boxes the problem of production. That black box is the problem of production. And then that's how we end up with this capabilities per dollar as the measured output and the metric of efficiency. Capabilities per dollar. And this is something that we end up really trying to problematize. Yes?
Sorry, can you unpack that idea about the black box again a little bit more?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
We'll get there.
That's right.
All right,
He's going to deal with that
Okay.
super explicitly. Yep. So the immediate post-Cold War legacy, we've got some interesting things going on. So one is our clear and grave threat, the Soviet Union, just basically vaporizes. And that seems awesome. So, but now what do we do in terms of defense planning? And you see in the 90s this rise of scenario-based planning versus capabilities-based planning. What do we plan against? Instead of just like, let's really focus on winning the Fulda Gap battle, which was the central like operational level challenge of the Cold War, defeating Soviet forces from flowing through the Fulda Gap. What do we plan? How do we shape our investments? And so if you don't have a really strong overarching scenario to plan for, people begin to talk about let's just think of capabilities we may want to have for the global United States as the global hegemon to project power around the world. And folks, some of you folks may remember like hold, win, hold, major regional contingencies, major regional conflicts, hold, win, win, whatever, but just picking a metric of conventional theater level or regional wars that we could fight at the same time. But it becomes a little unhinged from the specifics of a scenario, right? And so there's a big debate about this. Now, what this new problem of unhinging from particular scenarios to just talking about building out capabilities, this can be represented as uncertainty over the correct capabilities, right? Where are we fighting? What will we be doing? Oh, we need to establish air superiority. We need to be able to do, you know, whatever, fight a tank battle, you know, contested landing on a beach, etc. You can think of just tanks versus ships. There's uncertainty here. If you invest in all tanks, but a future war ends up being a naval war, you're out of luck. And if you invest in all ships and the future war ends up being a land war, you're out of luck because you invested in the wrong capabilities. So this is one type of uncertainty that people really began to wrestle with a lot during this period is like, we need to prognosticate to some degree in the future and think about the types of wars we're going to fight, the capabilities we'll need given these, you know, what the wars will look like, and hedge, blah, blah, blah. But this is one type of uncertainty about what the correct capabilities are. But what is neglected yet again from the Cold War and does not arise here is considering problems in performance. And what I don't mean is performance of the capabilities like the F-16 to fly as fast as it claims to, or the pilot to be as well trained as they are. We're talking about constraints on performance where you could get this highly capable, seemingly very professional, very well-equipped military being paralyzed by two guys in flip-flops with AK-47s. So constrained performance is something that this still doesn't loom large as a problem. Why are a couple reasons? One is that the Cold War military that we built, we trotted it out to fight Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, and it performed extraordinarily well. Handily defeated, better than almost anyone had estimated, more easily defeated the Iraqi military, which was a battle-hardened military, I believe at the time the fourth largest military in the world, and got trounced in what Stephen Biddle, I think, claims is the most lopsided military victory in human history. So a lot of people's fears about the actual performance of the Cold War military seem to have been vindicated in the Gulf War. And we immediately, for anybody, McCoy had not heard this term, but older folks may, RMA, the RMA debates of the 90s, Revolution in Military Affairs, where the United States began to get high on its own supply to a little bit. And the talk back then was full spectrum dominance. That actually, even if we have uncertainty over future scenarios, et cetera, we're just going to invest so much money. We're so much better militarily than any other force that we will achieve full spectrum dominance, right? This term was used a lot back then, kicked around in the 90s, full spectrum dominance. So this takes us through the 90s. And where does this lead us to? Is 9/11 and the global war on terror. Things begin to go off the rails. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, we begin to see the fact that there's clearly problems with these supposedly lesser included cases. The performance of the military, the promises of the military. Remember when Rumsfeld fired Shinseki for questioning the ease with which the United States would defeat and pacify Iraq? There begins to be cracks in our understanding of the capability of the US military. I should say, its ability to achieve effects. Despite all the investments, despite the overwhelming asymmetry in capabilities and technology, something seems to be going wrong in the global war on terror. So we're going to go back, and this is setting the stage for us. When we think of how planning and conceptualization of creating military power was formalized, or the foundation was set during the early Cold War, those models were built, those ways of thinking were built in the wake of the Second World War, and intended to design forces for a catastrophic war with a peer superpower in the USSR. But how does changing the size and nature of threats confound this approach? When you're not dealing with the Axis powers, when you're not planning for the Soviet Union, when you're in a world in which you are a hegemon surrounded by largely trivial threats, how does this confound your models of conceptualizing and planning military power? So given this, we still field seemingly really great capabilities. But so how did we end up with this $1 trillion noisemaker problem of sending this incredibly seemingly powerful military to Afghanistan for 20 years and having it leave with its tail between its legs? How might we use new analytic tools to address this problem? And to your question, and we're going to get to this, using these tools in particular to unpack this black box of production. And this is going to be where we're really going to focus, is when we think of unpacking the black box of production, moving from budgeting for national security through budgeting, planning, coercion, bargaining, all the way to war fighting, and thinking of that as a multi-stage production problem, how can we identify a new place to look for explanations for this $1 trillion noisemaker problem?
Sorry, before you go on.
Yep.
So, challenge you a little bit. Did you set up a little bit of a straw man that you were projecting, right, that we had a lot of scenarios based off of a Cold War mentality, and then you're asking why we didn't succeed in a non-Cold War scenario? Didn't you kind of answer?
So two things. One is what, you know, we really do want to focus on this lesser included problem, right? That considering, does being able to defeat the Soviets enable you to defeat what array of threats underneath it? That's a question, because in the 90s, it was considered not just that we had great, you know, whatever, great capabilities, but they had been hyper enabled through precision guided munitions, sensors, et cetera, to be precise, that we could defeat the entire scale. So one is just assuming this lesser included. We're going to obviously problematize that because people in the 90s and 2000 were pretty incorrect about that. And the second one, and that's why I brought up Bala Murghab, occurs 8 years after the invasion of Afghanistan. So even if people got the uncertainty totally wrong, or, you know, the uncertainty about future needs totally wrong, we had 8 years to adjust by Bala Murghab. And frankly, my last time in Afghanistan was 2017. And our way of doing things in Afghanistan had not gotten any better or more relevant in 2017. So even if that uncertainty, like they just didn't buy the right stuff ahead of time, the amount of money and effort, I should say the amount of money we dumped into, I'm just picking on Afghanistan, the amount of money we dumped into Afghanistan, and we spent 20 years there and had no real adaptation to the conflict after 20 years, that's incredibly puzzling. We started World War II, we still had biplanes in service. By the end of the war, we were experimenting with jets and had invented and deployed atomic weapons in 4 years, right? So think of the same nation that could adapt to World War II problems, has 20 years in Afghanistan and still cannot deal with a handful of dudes with AK-47s and flip-flops. That's incredibly puzzling. And that it doesn't matter what you started with, what bets or investments you had made up to 2001, the fact that by the end of the war, we still had not adapted to it is incredibly interesting. I mean, I think so.
Yeah,
right?
that's interesting. I don't know if everybody would believe you or agree with you that we didn't adapt over time in those theaters, though, right?
Yeah.
No?
Well,
I mean, there was some adaptation, right? I mean, we rolled out there with Humvees that didn't have enough armor, and we ended up with MRAPs.
Yeah, we'll talk about those adaptations because that's kind of ties with our argument. So that's interesting. Yeah. Cam, Lauren, that's really interesting, though.
Jacques Onsler, in his book Arsenal's Democracy, you know, he says sort of the same thing we're saying here, is that 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the national security apparatus is still doubling down on investments that it had been doubling down on since the 90s, right? After 20 years of losing two wars. So we can get back and debate this, but to me, it's incredibly puzzling that we have no answers by the end of Afghanistan. And yes, from Humvees to MRAPs, I mean, you know what I mean? Like World War II, you're going from biplanes to B-20, you know, B-29s and jet aircraft in 4 years. But we can continue talking. Like let's keep it going. But yeah, for sure. So given all this, we're going to try to do two things to try to come up with a new way of reframing this by backing out. backing out from the problem of capabilities, like planning around capabilities or capabilities per dollar. We're going to back out in two ways. One is we're going to focus on the real goal. The American taxpayer doesn't care about capabilities. They don't care about weapon systems. The American taxpayer pays tax dollars for the government to take those tax dollars and turn those into national security, right? For which capabilities is just an intermediate stage. So someone, and if you've ever, Brian McHugh has this great book, U-Boats in the Bay of Biscay, and it's sort of, yeah, it's a discussion of the intellectual history of the ORSA field, but he warns readers against what we're trying to do here. And he warns in this quote, it is an ill-informed approach in which designers start at the top of, let's say, a capability requirements weapons challenge, start at the top and work up, asking what the weapon's mission is, what the mission's purpose is, and so on, until they get to a lofty goal such as undisturbed continuation of the American way of life. This top-up process does not work. But that's what we're going to try to do today, is go top up and look at this space between building a capability all the way up to where you're producing national security and problematize. First off, we want to problematize it. And second, we want to give credit to the people in the early Cold War for developing the capabilities-focused model and actually show why it was actually a really good approximation for their problem set. It just hasn't stood up well in the post-Cold War world, right? So we're going to actually tackle this problem, moving up from neoclassical concepts of efficient battlefield capabilities to the actual production of national security. So that's one thing that we're going to do. And then to do that, we're going to widen the aperture of what we mean, what comes under study. So security is a multi-stage production process to support national welfare, and consider efficiency through the lens of national welfare rather than capabilities, which is simply an intermediate stage, and ascertain the conditions under which efficient choices are in equilibrium at all these stages of production. Asking the question, what is feasible security that can be produced given the investments, which is what we currently look at, and actors' expected behavior, which is something that doesn't figure into the neoclassical production model. Actors' expected behavior. And this allows us to address both the one challenge of what are the correct capabilities to invest in. Do you want to invest in tanks or ships, thinking about if the future war is going to be land-based or sea, naval, but also constrained performance, which is something that we can only look at the constrained performance of actors by opening up this production black box. And so this feasible production framework that we're going to look at, I'm just quickly introduce it, but then hand it over to Jason. The four stages of production, and these are obviously very sort of a crude carving up of this very complex process, but budgeting, planning, forces, using those forces to coerce or bargain with adversaries, and then ultimately potentially fighting adversaries with the forces. Consider the actors at all stages. Also consider that at every stage, every actor in the U.S. national security apparatus has a vector of incentives. They have a vector of things that they're pursuing. A promotion, a raise, a medal. A congressperson is in this national security apparatus. They're concerned about jobs in districts through pork barrel spending. Defense firms and contractors throughout this process, they're also interested in profit. You can have bureaucratic incentives, inter-service rivalry, etc. These are all incentives that every actor through the national security apparatus, just like every worker, every school teacher, every used car salesman, everyone has an array of goals that they're pursuing at any given time. Any reasonable person does. One of which, for people in the national security apparatus, is pursuit of mission. So pursuing the mission, given their context, given their job in the national security apparatus, that's one of the goals that they pursue. The question is, what is the conditions under which actors prioritize mission pursuit versus other goals? Profit, career, jobs in district, what have you. Weighing pursuit of mission versus these other pieces of their vector of incentives. Then most efficient, feasible outcome is obtained when actors' incentives are aligned to the pursuit of mission. And And what we're going to show later is that we think the key driver of incentive alignment for actors is the threat environment. That as the threat grows, that it actually, even though the nation in some respect becomes less safe because it's operating under a serious, grave, maybe existential threat, that this actually ends up producing very efficient national security because it's going to align incentives of actors throughout the national security apparatus towards pursuit of mission. Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. He's going to start unpacking from the bottom.
And this slide probably doesn't unpack enough, but I'm going to say a lot of words that are along with it. So we're going to start and back up a sec and just think about like the neoclassical production problem that everything was kind of built upon before, and what assumptions are there. And I don't know how many of you have taken much like economics, just basic economic stuff, and had to go through this, but we're going to go through it in an abstract way kind of quickly, but then talk about what's missing too here. And that's what's going to be important. So we think about neoclassical production, it's just the idea. We think about production, we take inputs, we make them into outputs, right? The canonical way to think about it, we have a firm, they have capital, physical things, then they have labor. And you put those two things together and you shoot out stuff. And we have this function that describes this idea of we shoot out the outputs. We think about it, in the where I'm like close to, I think about a firm close to where I live that they grow tomatoes, right? And what do? They put inputs. What do they have? They have their land, they have their labor, they have the actual fertilizer, water, electricity, machinery, and they get out tomatoes, tomato sauce, also a bunch of different outputs that come from the tomato-based plant. Okay, and that's kind of this standard model of production that neoclassical world uses and is used throughout all like intermediate level economics, and a lot of interesting stuff's built upon this. But there's a lot of stuff missing here, and that's really important, and it comes from the primary assumption that the neoclassical world had. If we look at like what was the most of the models, you're going to assume perfect information, right? In these kind of really, and that's just really a crazy assumption in some ways, but it's convenient, and as we know, all models aren't real, so sometimes it's convenient enough and it can give us new insights. But what does that really mean here? Well, it means that the firm owner knows the values of everything, and can observe them, particularly, so the inputs. Further, you know how much the value your labor can bring, and can observe it and make you work up to that value. So I can actually observe your effort. So it's implicit in this functional relationship and a core assumption of the neoclassical model. Okay, so now, and so what's gone from that's going to be really important to our whole, what we build from this point on, is what is coined in economics like the possibility for opportunists, right? The possibility for laborers to leverage the fact in a sense, and we could, it doesn't have to be in a negative way that you would say there, but to leverage the fact that you can observe everything, there's an information problem, and because of that, I have some latitude in what I can do, and I can have inefficient actions, right? And that's what we're going to see. So now, important to this problem, the production problem, it's going to be all the neoclassical version. Also, it's a profit maximization problem that the production lies within. So we have the firm, the owner of the firm wants to maximize profit. And now in order to maximize profit, a necessary condition is going to be that actually this production is what we're going to call, what we define as efficient production, which would be that for any level of output, the cost needs to be minimized. You need to pick the inputs that minimize the cost. But because of this perfect information, it's going to make this problem kind of well-formed and fairly easy to do. Okay, now, is it
to the right?
I'm just rewriting this as national security, right? It's the same thing. Now, I shouldn't have wrote that it necessarily lives in but it does. I just literally took the same thing. It could live in any space we want, right? But it doesn't have to be a finite dimensional Euclidean space. But the idea is, now if we view it the same way, right? Now notice right away, though, even doing this, we don't get to where this is capabilities yet, right? At all. We're just reviewing this problem as, hey, inputs to national security. And then what's the purpose of national security? Well, national security, what does it do? It secures the national welfare. So it's really, we want national security because we could think of it as like it increases our expected discounted welfare of all the possibilities in the world, of the nation. Now, we haven't defined what welfare is, and but that's the basic idea here. So we're framing it as the same, a parallel problem here in a simple sense. But as we're going to point out, what's missing is going to be here, if we have that same assumption of perfect information, then we can think of it in the exact same way, where we're going to reduce it to this input choice, the input the lowest cost to get the most national security, if we know this mapping. But this mapping, like we said, that's part of that perfect information. And if we have agents who are going to behave differently in different environments, like think of our laborers, then we're going to create this problem where this mapping is going to change. Right? And so, before I back it up, because you might have questions what we mean by national welfare, because that's pretty important. And here, and as what was the name of the author who, God, I can't think of his name, the book on McHugh said, and like Hitch and McKean point this out too, really hard, they want to get away from national welfare right away, right? They want to get away. And I agree with them in the sense, in practice, like empirically, that's a huge problem, because how do we even calculate this? But there can be very useful in abstract to use this idea to pin to understand when something's working and something's not. And maybe we need to think about it a little bit more. And that's really what we're going to do here. It's an abstract argument, okay? And you can judge how useful it is to you by the end, but that's really what we're going to do here, okay? But what do we think about it? What do you have in your mind? I mean, it's hard to pin down, like some multidimensional totality of value, right? I don't know how many of you know like Arrow's impossibility theorem, who says, you probably don't, but the idea that, there's really no way to simply aggregate welfare of a bunch of individuals. We know that problem's there. Now, what do macroeconomists try to do? They try to say, oh, just GDP. I'm going to dog on them for a sec, sorry. But that's not a very good measure, but anyway, in your mind, think about this really as we're going abstract, right? Some notion of, and the key thing is we're going to use it just to, as we said, make our argument abstractly, and that's most important, and keeping that in mind is probably the best. And really what we want to think about is when can we get away from this concept, and when can we get to like some capabilities, thing like they do? And that's kind of a question. I wish now, because I see the questions you asked, that I would have put more of the formality of doing that in this talk, but that's okay. Okay. And so to understand this question more, we need a framework to unpack, and he already gave us kind of the basic framework of that. We're going to break it. This is our 4 levels. As we know, this is not going to necessarily merge with how practitioners view it, as we've said, or these terms. So these terms might mean something a little different than what you're used to using. But what we mean by budgeting here is the idea that someone's making a choice of how much resources to put in to defense. That's a set, because I don't want it just a number. The idea it's a set of resources, okay? Didn't define, but the idea, we think about like Congress or something of the sort decides, US. Then we have the next stage, and this is all part of the production of national security. All these are part of the production, which is coercion. Because then to get national security, you're going to have to figure out how to use the force to actually get national security, whether to threaten it, whether to actually take action. These kind of political things come in as well. And that the choices we're just going to call C, some abstract idea. And then we get to the idea of actually what we're going to call planning, is where you choose the actual, resource, the specifics of how we're going to use this budget. So we could say the budget's all possible sets of resources we could use, and this is a choice of a specific one, right? Okay. We're abstracting away from time here, uncertainty, else. It's very, very, so forgive me on all that. And then we have warfighting. And warfighting, again, we're just going to call it some actions. So think again, if this, like this lies within this, they choose the set of possibilities, they choose the particular, okay? Okay. Now, we're going to jump here a little away from this, and think about this problem in a sense, to go back to the capabilities idea. Thinking about, because here we're looking at the planning stages where maybe where really when we think of McNamara and these ideas of capabilities, you know, maximum capabilities for the budget, or hitting a certain amount of capabilities at the lowest cost, where those come from.
Jason.
Yeah.
And also, I think we wrote 2 and 3 reverse order.
Oh yeah, we put these in reverse order. Sorry.
Sorry. We wrote these slides. We arrived last night. We wrote slides this morning.
Yeah, so the way we have it on the other one is reversed.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Important, or because
Well, if you think about it as like a truly dynamic game, it's not particularly important because they're all going to affect each other, right? And nest in a way. They're going to be, there's like this idea of in equilibrium only like in the short term, but and especially between these two, not so much, because you know they're at one level, yes, but in the future the choices are all going to.
yeah, because in the way our system currently is, right, R would normally come before B. Like we propose a plan and then they approve the budget.
The budget, yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, but and that's I guess in a sense.
Yeah. In the real world, they're all going on simultaneously.
Yeah, they're all going simultaneously.
We just had written them in the other order before, so I just
Yeah,
our jet lagged selves this morning put these in the wrong order.
that's why it does. And then we have the dynamics of them going on over and over and over again too, and that we're abstracting away from all it. So the one thing that kind of does matter is in the sense that all these things have to be at least something previously fixed before this one, right? Before those actions are taken, right? Yeah. And there's and the idea in the thinking is that even when you're choosing this, you have an idea about those in the past and how they're going to come along for the right in the future, right? That's the idea. But and okay. But let's say we're looking at that planning, deciding on the resources from some fixed budget, and there's nothing like mystical about this. The idea when is this going to have the same solution as this? Well, I mean. When is capability maximization going to maximize national security when these two things have the same solution, right? There's nothing, and I've written this as an expectation. Well, national security helps determine the expectation. I'm not saying any which way, right? Over the possible states of the future, okay, and the resources. But you could see right away that's not clear, okay, that those two things are going to coincide, and particularly not if these capabilities. It depends on. Even thinking really clever about the capabilities and all the possibilities, what really becomes unclear is the problem of how these are going to be affected by these two choices. The choices of the political choices of how force is used and threatened, if it's done suboptimally, if it's done for other reasons, you know, then that's going to change things a lot on basically how much national welfare we get out of a set of resources. Further, the way the war is actually fought. Going to have, as Leo went through in depth, dramatic changes. You know, if instead the example he went in, instead they decided, hey, pull the trigger, that conflict's done, right? So it's this war fought here that really made the everything ineffective in the example, the leading example. Okay, so I think right here. Now, what we're going to use as kind of our key parameter, and we're going to treat it as exogenous for the current discussion, is, as Leo hinted to, is the idea of the threat environment. And what we call the threat environment. And this is an idealized thing in terms of the way we're going to define it. And we have two ends of the spectrum. And let me talk about those two extreme ends, and then we can kind of go between. What we call existential. That's going to be the extreme end of like World War II. But in reality, even the extreme, it's a concept like infinity. It's all the way to the edge, right? Where this threat is so extreme that no one in the whole economy wants to do anything except make sure you win that conflict, right? Everyone. Because it's life or death for everyone, and that's what's most important, right? That's the pinned edge of existential. Well, what happens in that case? All incentives are aligned for this one for maximize national welfare, which is maximized through winning this conflict, right? And we no longer have to worry about these opportunist problems or any of these problems of pursuing other incentives, right, of anyone. So then we get to a world where, in this world too, the mission becomes much simpler. It's usually it's going to be a more measurable, simplified mission. And this is going to make things fit much better with capabilities, traditional capabilities planning. Okay. On the other end of the spectrum, we get to the trivial threats. And now what's here that's so difficult is we're in a situation where now we have people pursuing all kinds of other interests at all levels, right? We have to worry about Congress pursuing other interests. We have to worry about the president pursuing other interests. We have to worry about, the kind of every level other interests, including the warfighter, who justifiably might be thinking more about their career than the current conflict because they don't really understand what it's doing and it feels trivial to them, right? Okay. So now conclusions, and we're going to keep going on, and he's going to get more into warfighting now, and we'll talk about, but basic ideas here, and is towards the end of the existential end of the spectrum, we have alignment of incentives around the mission. We have this constrained performance problems disappear. Uncertainty about correct capabilities in the sense of like, we know the capability is going to be used to its full extent, so we don't have that type of uncertainty anymore. So that really cleans things up. On the other end of the spectrum is the trivial situation, where now we have misalignment of incentives throughout the production process. Constraints on performance loom very large. We're going to see, because people, we're going to see things like induced risk aversion, uncertainty over correct capabilities, because are they even going to be used, right? And now what we'll move to Leo, kind of digging much deeper into warfighting aspect. Okay. Any questions before or?
Well, and this will, I think, double tap and illustrate what we really want to get down is to performance of agents and really sorting out what we mean by constrained performance. And a lot of it is going to have to do with what actors are rewarded and punished for at the warfighting level, and how this may induce risk aversion. Because we go back to that Bala Murghab example, what we see there is the paralysis of a super well-funded, high-quality military essentially being paralyzed by risk aversion. So let's go back to World War II. And what are some really attractive things about World War II? So let's look at this guy. He's a fighter ace. And you can see on the side of his plane, he has these little paintings of Nazi flags. And what does that mean? These are enemy fighter planes he's shot down. And what's a really attractive feature of that is represented by this picture is that we have a tactical fighter, a tactical warfighter here. And it's clear that it's clear to him and it's clear to his boss what his marginal contribution to the war is and what better looks like. And this is incredibly important. So two things we can say about this. One is if he comes back from a mission and he shot down 5 German fighter planes and they had cameras in the wings so you could verify, kills of German aircraft. What is his marginal contribution to the war? The more German fighter aircraft he shoots down at the tactical level is going to establish air superiority over German cities, so we can strategically bomb those German cities, shut down wartime production of tanks and other equipment, which is then going to allow US ground forces to take territory all the way to Berlin, which is going to lead to the defeat of the Nazi regime. So we can draw a direct line from his tactical activity at the tactical, the operational, the strategic, the grand strategic foreign policy level. We understand what his contribution is. And it's also nice, guess what no one ever said to this fighter pilot? No one ever said, sorry, Bob, you shot down too many German fighter airplanes today. No one ever said that. So there's a monotonic relationship between his marginal contribution and the national security goals of the United States. He never overproduced his tactical activity. These are really cool things. And then what can we do for, ground units, air units, naval units? It's clear what the marginal contribution of each activity is. And it's also exhibiting this monotonic relationship on foreign policy goals for the United States. Let's think about some other aspects of World War II. The strategic bombing campaign over Germany and especially Japan. The United States began the war trying to engage in something called precision bombing, trying to just bomb specific targets, ball bearing plants or rail yards, etc. And they basically gave up and engaged in area carpet bombing in Germany. And in Japan, it was a stated policy under General LeMay. The metric of performance for the Air Force in Japan was square miles of urban cities burned to the ground. Curtis LeMay admitted that he was absolutely conscious of the fact that he was killing and dehousing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. And he said if we had lost the war, we would have been put on trial at Nuremberg instead of the bad guys. But for the sake of pursuing the mission, he deemed it acceptable. Let's look at this picture. This is a submarine in World War II called the Bowfin. And you can see this physical flag. It's at Pearl Harbor. And same thing as the fighter pilot. They put up their kills on the flag. Can anybody see this kill from back there?
They dropped off a couple of guys and blew up a train.
Well, they used their deck gun. It's a crane and a school bus that they blew up with their deck gun. They surfaced and blew up a school bus and a crane with their deck gun. But what's more interesting is one of these kills, they sank a Japanese ship. They claimed it was a Japanese destroyer. And naval intelligence was like, that's not a destroyer. The silhouette of it doesn't look right because they have to take pictures through the periscope as they sink ships. It was actually a ferry called the Tsushima Maru, which had about 1,500 Japanese civilians in it, 900 of whom were school children, and they all died. What happened to the Bowfin commander? Nothing. It was deemed as like a mistake, and the war carried on. What is this picture? This picture appeared in Life magazine. And this is a woman named, I for some reason remember her name, Natalie Nickerson, and her boyfriend was in the Navy. And he sent her a Japanese skull in the mail. And she has it on her desk, and she's writing a love letter back thanking him for sending her a Japanese soldier's skull.
Different time.
And if you and this was in Life magazine, and under the picture quote, Life magazine says the U.S. Army disapproves of this type of behavior. And if you think this was not widespread, Charles Lindbergh, who was a celebrity during World War II, he toured the Pacific Theater, and his first point of entry back in the United States was in Hawaii. And at customs, they asked him, do you have any human body parts to declare? A necklace of teeth, dried ears, shrunken heads, skulls. They were so common that they asked you to declare them at customs. Why do I bring this up? Well, actually, let's go on to another example. Let's go to Vietnam. So in the World War II picture, we had a map. Remember a map? That was the breakout of the Normandy beachheads. Has anybody seen Saving Private Ryan? Remember when they go into that rainy village and they meet the Ted Danson character? And Tom Hanks's character and Ted Danson's character have a discussion about how's the war going? How are we doing? Are we breaking out of the bridgeheads? And they have a quick discussion of geography. And in 5 seconds, they can establish the progress of the war by mentally thinking of maps and territorial gains. But what is the problem in Vietnam? This is a famous book by Thayer, War Without Fronts and Air Mobility, that in Vietnam, we lose the capacity to measure progress in the war through geography. This becomes a big, big problem. And then we come up with a strategy for Vietnam. What was the US strategy in Vietnam? Was to develop a self-sustaining South Vietnamese regime. And so you see these pictures, med caps, soldier with a child on his back, programs like combined cap cord programs, etc. to do what? What does all this represent? Win hearts and minds of the people. Do some warfighting stuff, but win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people to establish a viable South Vietnamese regime. That sounds great. But what about metrics of performance in Afghanistan or in Vietnam? Whoops, Freudian slip. The body count, right? Killing Vietnamese and being rewarded for killing Vietnamese people. a lot of whom, has anybody seen, what was that movie? Full Metal Jacket. Remember the gunner on the helicopter? And the main character says, he's just shooting at women and children, like, as the helicopter's flying over rice paddies. And he says, you know, how can you tell if they're North Vietnamese? You know, how can you tell if they're Viet Cong? And he's like, if they're running, they're Viet Cong. And he says, what about if they're standing still? They're well-disciplined Viet Cong. Anyway, but the point is that we create a metric of performance which it incentivizes this very problematic overproduction of violence, which actually works against the strategy of the war, which is to win hearts and minds. If you read McNamara's memoirs, he talks about realizing this problem later, that they created this metric of performance that rewarded one activity, which was killing, but realizing that began conflicting with all these other vectors and priorities of strategy in Vietnam. So we lose this easy capacity that we had in World War II, where guess what? In World War II, what did you do with violence all the time? Turn it up to 11. In World War II, you could almost not produce too much violence. And due to the existential nature of the war, it was deemed acceptable. If you colored outside the lines in World War II, that was not a problem. But in places like Vietnam, in places like Afghanistan, this actually becomes a crippling problem. So when we compare an existential war like World War II, what are some things that are really attractive in terms of measurement and in terms of incentive structure for warfighters in a war like World War II? Easy to nest activities from the tactical, operational to the strategic level. That fighter pilot, you can easily tell his marginal contribution all the way up to the strategic level. And any other things that he does, let's consider, let's say, a strategic bombing raid. If you take out that ball bearing plant, that contributes to the war in a very particular way. If you happen to bomb a school full of children next to it, it kind of doesn't matter. It really does. It does not matter in World War II. And believe me, we did that time and time again. Easy to choose clean metrics that capture the intent, that capture what you want to measure from that act or behavior, and easy to capture values for those metrics. It's easy to take pictures of Japanese cities burned to the ground. It's easy to take pictures of you shooting down a German fighter plane or sinking a Japanese ship. And it's easy to establish this positive monotonic impact on the intended effect because you don't have these other concerns, countervailing concerns to worry about. So it's easy to reward useful behavior in agents, like the fighter pilot example. And then, so how do you think of this in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors? So errors of commission or errors of omission. So in World War II, errors of omission are punished. So not pursuing the mission gets punished. If you go back and read about World War II, the number of general officers in World War II that were relieved of command, for why? Because they weren't producing. They weren't taking territory. They weren't destroying enemy forces. That you were punished for not pursuing the mission. But we saw before with these other pictures that you could commit, America did not, I believe, did not intend to commit war crimes in World War II. But we did. We committed a lot of them. We just thought it needed to be done in pursuit of the mission, right? I believe if an American service member today sunk a ship that ended up killing 1,500 civilians, 900 of whom were school children in Afghanistan, that would be a big deal. That was not a big deal in World War II. And so you can easily manipulate the risk attitude of actors towards the mission. So basically, like, pursue the mission, ignore everything else, right? Let's consider the trivial conflict, a less serious conflict like in Afghanistan. The complexity of exogenous factors leads to problems of non-monotonicity of actor behavior and strategic goals. Because engaging in burning a village in Afghanistan, Afghanistan or Vietnam, that if you kill some enemy soldiers, that contributes to the war effort. If you kill some civilians or someone's videotaping you burning down a village, can create all these political problems, all these social, normative, political constraints, which now weigh heavily because the threat of the conflict is actually not that large. Difficult to assess actors now with simple metrics and guide behavior via rewards mechanisms. Anybody remember you were talking about VSO programs? Anybody remember village stability operations in Afghanistan? There was a special warfare magazine that came out, and it's for the special, largely the U.S. Army Special Forces community, and they had an issue on how to do VSO. And it was really sad because it was like, VSO is really important. We need to safeguard the villages and protect them from the Taliban. So you may need to kill some people, but don't do it too much. And then it's like, you may need to hand out some money, but not too much because you're going to retard the development of the local economy. You may need to engage in some infrastructure projects, but not too much because you're going to create corruption. So it was actually, and they were like, you'll figure it out. You're a professional. That is incredibly difficult onus to put on the warfighter, as opposed to the World War II fighter pilot, which was do what? Shoot down as many German fighter planes as you can. And instead, we had this incredibly complex with these environment in places like Afghanistan and Vietnam, with these countervailing threads. And pursuing one may mean that you're damaging another one, and it becomes, what can happen? You can end up paralyzing the decisions of that warfighter. So not taking this into account, you get the Vietnam example, the body count example. Errors of commission, here you do get punished for stepping over the line. In Afghanistan, CivCas, civilian casualties, extremely big deal, right? Whereas in World War II, absolutely not a big deal at all. Induced risk aversion around pursuing the mission. And we were having discussions around this before. Pursuing the mission would involve putting your career at risk in many cases. A lot of folks show up in Afghanistan, and I spent not a lot of time in Afghanistan, but I periodically visited Afghanistan over the years. And a lot of it was like, hey, we're here to do our job and not mess up. We're here to spend from day one, first day to the last day of our deployment here, and do stuff, but not make any mistakes. It was all about avoiding errors of commission. One of your guys gets killed, and that's seen as your fault, your career's done. You kill, one of your guys kills a civilian, your career's done. One of your subordinates talks to Rolling Stone magazine, and they make fun of the presidential, the president, your career's done. As far as I know, and someone can correct me, as far as I know, the only general officer that was relieved of command in Afghanistan that I know of offhand was done because of his subordinates talking to Rolling Stone magazine. In World War II, many general officers were relieved of command because they were not pursuing the mission hard enough. So when this happens, you get paralysis, and that's the Bala-Murghab example we started off originally, and the strategic corporal problem. What is the strategic corporal? Does anybody ever think of a strategic corporal that wins the war? Strategically wins the war? No. When does a corporal become a strategic corporal? When they accidentally or on purpose shoot someone. Sergeant Bales example, remember Sergeant Bales? Left his combat outpost and murdered an Afghan family, created a huge problem. This sergeant just lost his mind, whatever. Bo Bergdahl wanders off of a fob, shuts the war down for like 3 or 4 days. Those are the types of strategic corporals we think about because of all these countervailing constraints that are not about the mission. So the reason that we deep dove on that warfighting stage is because if you're thinking about building capabilities, if you're thinking about building highly trained forces with totally great weapon systems, etc., and not taking into consideration the production problem, the incentive structure for decision makers on the battlefield or at the coercion stage, then you may have this falsely inflated sense of the capability of the forces you're creating. And this is going to create the problem for falling into wars that you don't intend to fall into because you're not actually deterring adversaries that seem much weaker than you are, and you're going to fall into wars that are much more difficult than you may anticipate them being. I'm going to hand it back to Jason, and he's going to just like, this is our, sorry, question.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
yeah, so it seems like the two examples you picked for the lesser warfighting stage were potentially where our policy was not the best also.
Yeah.
And that could also have a very significant impact on how these forces performed and what they were able to do.
Yep.
So
I absolutely agree. And
Okay.
so when you say policy, to me, when you talk about 9/11 happens, right? Kind of out of the blue, 9/11 happens, and then Afghanistan's on the radar. What do we do about Afghanistan? And I think this is the stage where when the president looks for options of things to do about Afghanistan is where is here. Is like, what do we do about Afghanistan? And the choice to sort of invade Afghanistan, to take down the regime and to try to create something else there. To me, that's what we're talking about here at the coercion stage. Is so if you think about the fear on, coercion models in political science often use the modified expected utility equation of Fearon. Benefits times probability of accruing those benefits minus costs times probability of accruing those costs minus also fixed costs for warfighting. People talk about that a lot. The key is two things. One is pre-war, if I'm gonna like get in a you and I are fighting over a candy bar or something like that. We have this issue that we're in contestation over. I'm trying to make estimates about the likelihood of me using my force to actually grab the candy bar, like so what the distribution of that candy bar will be after the conflict, and also my fixed costs for fighting. So the key is before the war, for me, before I make that effort to create estimates of that probability distribution of me achieving my goals in the war and the fixed costs of fighting. What we're warning about here is the fact that in October, November of 2001, the US thinking about its ambitions of what it wants to do in Afghanistan are predicated on the leadership's belief of our ability to get things done at what time and what cost. And if you would have told the American president in October 2001, it's going to cost, if you only send about $1 trillion in 20 years of investment, we're going to lose. You'd have to go bigger than that. Imagine going back in time to October 2001 and saying, hey, I saw into the future and we only invested 20 years and with second, third order effects put into it for just Afghanistan alone, $1 trillion. It's going to cost $1 trillion in 20 years. At least it's going to actually cost more than that. If you just invest 20 years and $1 trillion, you're not going to achieve what you want. That is what we're talking about here.
Well, but
Right.
I guess maybe you're asking it also in a way that is not showing the benefit of what happened, which is to say we had no foreign actors from that region acting on the United States for that 20-year period also. So is it worth, so you could ask it the other way, is it worth $1 trillion to have no attacks on the United States for that 20-year period?
Yeah, what, or you could have said then, what? So we can dial back. We could think back like other things to do in Afghanistan, right? Install the Northern Alliance, right? We can't reformulate Afghanistan in our image.
Yeah.
We're not going to make it a democracy. We're not going to change gender relations in Afghanistan. We're not going to develop the economy. We're going to install the Northern Alliance as our strongman and use it as a counterterrorism base for the region, something like that. But the point is when they're like, hey, because special operations and the CIA go into Afghanistan and they basically take down the Taliban. And then, as far as I know, and people may know more than me, 10th Mountain Division headquarters element shows up. And the Northern Alliance is like, what are those guys doing here? Well, U.S. policy is now we're going to take over your country and remake it in our image. And a lot of people in the special operations community look for those helicopters of 10th Mountain Leadership Command element coming in as the beginning of the end of whatever. But the point is someone is telling the president at that point, like, hey, we already took down the Taliban. It was easy cheesy. We can now get all these other goals because we can do it. Because we're so much more powerful and more wealthy than them. Let's just reformulate the whole country in our image. That is an incredibly ambitious set of goals. Why did they think we are capable of doing that. The civil relations at the time should have been the political leadership and the military leadership coming to realistic estimations of what the U.S. military could do to accomplish those goals. And we spent 20 years and a whole bunch of money failing at that. And so if you go back, I mean, and if you're like, hey, we just need a footprint, a lily pad to conduct counterterrorism operations in the region, we could have done that a lot cheaper. Installed a strongman and then set up a base and then got to work, right? Freedom Sentinel started in October 2001 without trying to take over the whole country. Yeah.
So at the start of your talk, you talked about the first Gulf War being a success.
Yeah.
How would you think was it like the missions, like body counts, just how the success, that kind of framework? And what do you think that would have, that was what led to the success in that case?
So in terms of the first Gulf War, success, I mean, there's different ways, obviously, you can carve up anything. A lot of people think first Gulf War was a problem because we didn't end up dismantling the Saddam Hussein regime. So it's this limited, so in one sense, let's talk about it, limited war aims to kick the Iraq army out of Kuwait, succeeds phenomenally well. And the actual battlefield performance of US forces blows almost all observers' minds. And people may know more than me, but pre-war American, I believe the Rand Corporation, pre-war estimates of US casualties were like orders of magnitude higher than what actually occurred. So it ended up being this incredibly successful war at the operational level in terms of defeating what people thought was a really tough, capable Iraqi military. They had just come out of like 8 or 9 years of war with Iran, incredibly battle-hardened military, not the greatest equipment in the world, but like a photocopy of Soviet equipment, like one generation, 2 generation behind Soviet equipment, which we thought it was going to be a tough war. And the fact that U.S. military sliced through the Iraqi military like a hot knife through butter really surprised people. And so 2 things. One is the war ended up being much easier than people estimated it would be at the operational level. Was it a political success? I mean, that's, I think, a different question. But secondly, that people thought it gave a vision into the future of something that was going to be the new way of war, and it would be a way of war that the Americans were miles ahead of everyone else, which was not just having the ability to blow stuff up, but because of precision and networked sensors, that you'd have this really bloodless way to destroy anything on the battle space almost instantaneously with total precision. At least at the time, this was this euphoric sense of like I said, the RMA literature at the time, people were like losing their minds over what the Gulf War meant, the future of war was going to be, and an assurance to ourselves that we were going to be miles ahead of everyone else for the foreseeable future. And because of the precision, as opposed to World War II, let's say dumb carpet bombing, because of the precision that you could scale down the scalpel to kill much lesser included threats. Right? You could detect and destroy anything you sensed in the battle space that you saw as a bad thing. You could just blow it up. Yes.
So I think, maybe just a psychologist in the room, that the juxtaposition of the big capital W war existential crisis versus trivial war, smaller conflicts, does somewhat look past the complicating factor of social and cultural changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
There was a cultural acceptance that no longer exists for, civilian casualties.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't think that's entirely just that it was existential. I think part of that is just people have changed
Times have changed
over time.
Yep.
I think some of it is
Yeah.
that it was seen as an existential crisis for us.
Yeah.
And very much, us versus them. They, like, World War II was coming against us, whereas Afghanistan is like over there, so maybe don't kill other people.
Yeah.
Because, they're not coming at us, so please try not to kill the civilians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, putting up a straw man and tearing it down. It's completely, that's neither here nor there, but I think that maybe there's some room to consider
Yeah.
and the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and more access to wars having an impact on those complicated feelings that the warfighter is feeling. It's no longer just go kill the things.
Yeah.
Is not as simple because, well, there's a media guy back there who's going to take a picture and they're going to figure out who I just killed.
Right.
And if it's not the right person, I'm now going to have consequences.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think that somewhat plays in and will continue to play in.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it doesn't undo anything, but I think it's worth considering.
Absolutely. And we were talking about, so in political science, international relations literature, we talk about norms, constraints. And we were talking about this today. I wrote a book, it was published in 2012, and on the last page predicts that as the U.S. hegemony declines and you have rise of autocratic powers, that we could see those autocratic powers using territorial aggrandizement, grabbing territory. When I published that book in 2012, people literally told me, like, your model predicts powerful entities grabbing territory in the near future. That's literally the word, which is not a word you want to hear when you're presenting your research. Was told that's laughable because norms had changed to the point that territorial sort of stability was taken. Yeah, and so it was so against the norm to use force to take territory that it's ridiculous. It's like slavery. No one would go enslave someone else. But I wrote in that book that, oh, norms are norms until changing conditions. And I'm not saying norms aren't real and it's not a real thing, but it's not always clear how and when norms change.
Right.
So
yeah. They do have impact.
Yeah, that's right.
Whether or not they're changing.
Yeah,
They do have impact.
But and it's hard to study the marginal impact of norms.
Well, it's hard
because
to
they're
use them
such.
for prediction. You can certainly study them. You
Yeah.
can quantify them,
Yeah.
but to
Right.
predict
Yeah.
using norms is
Yeah.
to try and predict human behavior, and that's messy.
Yeah, that's right. And all we can do is sort of guess. Like if we got into an existential war with China, let's say, like how norms might constrain or not constrain activity. That's something we can just guess about, I guess, or estimate.
Really, norms would just really would make it harder to be existential, right? That was what it would really mean in terms of our interpretation. Like the idea that all this, like if we have all these, we have now, we can see everything. We can see the war is really bad. We can see that we don't like to see that innocent people are killed. It's going to make it harder to kind of be that farther on the spectrum, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't exist necessarily. You know what I mean? That would be my interpretation.
Is your guys' hypothesis then, if we were to be back in that space, that the measures used in World War II would become more available? Is that kind of, or more true?
If it's viewed as that existential, then
Yeah.
yeah.
I think if we get in a war where we literally think our nation is going to be extinguished, then I think that it would number one, according to our model, that it would allow incentive alignment, the prioritization of pursuit of mission to the exclusion of all else. Like that's what our model predicts. Now it's not as clean. It's not as clean as we're making it here, but that as threat increases, it does a lot of things. Let's, for example, and I mean, whatever, if China, let's just say a country is seen as more and more of a threat to the United States, both in terms of capabilities and the specific operational challenges it creates, that's going to do a number of important things for U.S. planning, as you guys all know. One is making more specific scenarios that you can plan capabilities around. But the second thing that you may want to think about is like, it would also help create incentive alignment through actors throughout the system. Not just what I talked about there, the war fighters, but in World War II, all of these stages of the system, go back and study the aluminum industry during World War II. Aluminum became incredibly important because you use it for the skin of airplanes. And the aluminum industry was giving the US government trouble in and around World War II because they knew that they had this commodity that was becoming much, much more important. The government did not mess around, right? Like they would crush anything that got in the way of wartime production. So it's not just the warfighter. Like we're talking,
They
trying to talk about
illegally
incentive
split the
alignment.
aluminum industry into 3 companies.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, it was Alcoa, and then it made it into 3. It's not legal at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but just did it, and everybody held up.
Prioritization of mission at that point.
Yeah, 'cause
So,
everything.
so that's what our model suggests, but whatever. So, I mean, we're kind of going longer than we thought. I'm just gonna just wrap up with really 2 things and then hand it back to Jason. He's just got a couple more slides, and then we can do whatever. But not earth-shattering insight here, but this notion of breaking open national security, moving it from a model that we've inherited, sort of legacy set of models that talk about optimization of capabilities planning, moving that up to this considering production all the way to the stage of producing security for the national welfare, and then thinking about these stages of actors and the conditions under which their incentives are aligned or misaligned against the mission. At this point in the talk, or when we present the work, this is where it's kind of a bummer for everyone, because the bummer is like we only really achieve, and according to our model, we only really achieve efficient national security production when we're fighting for our lives. And so that's this sort of paradoxical sort of insight. And then the question is, well, what do we do to make our lives better, do a better job the rest of the time? And that's where we don't have such great prescriptions, but this is what we're trying to work on right now. But
We'll try our best.
did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, just a comment back to what you were just saying. If we're not willing to fight for something less than our lives, then that means we're never ready to fight for our lives, it seems to be.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that, we want to be continually engaged in a war and all.
Yeah.
But it somehow kind of comes back to the norm thing, that if we are so constrained by norms not to get in a fight where there are things really at stake, we in some ways make things more insecure because people think we're more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think you're, I don't disagree. What I would say is I think our pre-war estimates, even for limited wars or wars of choice, like our pre-war estimates of how difficult it's going to be, we need to be more realistic about. Because if we're just counting up capabilities, us versus the Taliban or us versus whomever, like it looks like, oh, we'll be home by the weekend. But if we take into account the difficulty, and I don't know, a really powerful piece of writing, I don't know if anybody remembers from the Vietnam War, a guy named Comer wrote a really long RAND report that was absolutely genius called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing. And a lot of when we were writing this was inspired, he just was like, he's like, I'm spending a year in Afghanistan researching for RAND. And what I'm seeing is everyone here is here. They're working every day, but they're just turning the crank. No one understands how their activity contributes to what we're trying to do over here. And no one's trying to actually make a marginal impact on the war. They're all just turning the crank every day. And I think, if you do push your nation into a war of choice against a seemingly much weaker enemy, and you don't take into account this performance constraint problem, you may end up in a war that's much longer and much less easy than you thought of. Now, once you consider all that, do you think it's worth it? That's where we're really trying to concerned about, are those pre-war estimates of how difficult and how long this is going to take, and getting a better estimate of that. There's just a couple slides. I know it's getting
Well,
long.
we're already jumped into quite a bit of this. So
Yeah, this will be wrap up.
That's kind of where.
We don't want to smoke you guys too much.
And that's down here, exactly what he was saying, which is kind of a punchline we're getting into. But the reality is this project, as you can kind of tell, it's this whole book, and we're really interested in all the stages. For this, we're kind of focusing in on planning, which is probably our least developed in some sense.
Yeah.
but it's a good exercise for us to do. And I'll get to what he was talking about there at the end here, but so now we're just going to focus in on planning again. And the idea is, as soon as we have a non-existential world, we have this problem of potentially incentives driving things off the rails where people are no longer going to be producing efficiently. And what's interesting to think about, like the 2 cases of the the initial Gulf War versus like Afghanistan are different in fundamental ways where you could think of a trivial conflict that actually our capabilities can handle versus can't in terms of the incentive problems too. We look at Iraq 1, it's a situation where it's a very simple goal, right? Take down the regime quickly. That was it. Like, you know what I mean? Push, not say take down, push the, sorry, not take the regime, push the army back, right? Get them out of the territory. We're done. We're in an area where there's not civilians to worry about. We can just come in, boom, 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 right? So, and you're not going to be in a situation, most of it coming from air, then we roll in the tanks later, where incentive problems are going to come in for the military too much either, because if they're not putting a lot of risk, they're not in risk of damaging people that are going to damage their career. It's pretty simple, right? In terms of that sense, simple goals, everything can be aligned, and we don't have to worry so much about those incentive problems, even though we don't have an existential threat, right? But as soon as we get into any conflict that's more complicated, like Afghanistan, then those incentive problems blow everything up. And that's kind of maybe not something we highlighted yet, but that's an idea there. It doesn't always have to blow up every kind of conflict in a trivial world, but anyone where there's an opportunity for those incentive problems to come in, they're going to come in, right? And that's the big concern. So thinking of here, what we want to think about in economics, we call this the second best problem. The idea that in a lot of these cases, we're going to have all the other actors in the system, if you're like the planner, planning the resources, making decisions that are not optimal. That's what we call in economics the second best solution, that the best we can do is account for that and then make our optimization. That we shouldn't be assuming they're going to be optimal when they're not, right? We have to assume that we have to try to understand their actual behavior. And that's what's called, it's like from the 70s, in terms of second best problem. And let's first look and think about the simple case. And the simple case is where we assume that the coercion happens optimally, meaning the politicians we're not worried about like the civil military thing he was talking about. We're thinking about political actions are optimal. Then the only thing we really have to take into account in this planning stage is that warfighting incentives are going to be suboptimal. And and if we're going to do some kind of capabilities planning, we could just adjust it in a sense, or this is our thought. You can tell us if you don't think this is reasonable or not, but the idea, if you could somehow kind of have an idea of the probability of all these different types of conflicts we're going to get into, and design your capabilities for those capabilities for conflicts like Afghanistan, if we're going to be stuck in those, right? Trying to figure that out. The idea that in that conflict, we know these incentive problems are going to be there. We know that people are going to be incredibly risk averse, and we take that into account in the kind of force we're creating if we're going to go down that road, right? If politically that's going to be something that's going to happen. Now, when we get to what I say the hard case is as soon as we allow bigger problems to come in, and particularly problems with coercion, and the idea of this information problem between the military and the civilian leadership, these estimates, these are bigger level problems where that's going to be suboptimal. We're going to get into then we have a whole bigger problem to try to deal with planning wise. Why? Because now we could also potentially stop bad things from happening, right? Now that's really complicated, something like a planner is never going to think of. But the idea is the force you've created might create certain pathologies or allow certain pathologies to happen in these situations. Now that's a really complicated thing to dig into. I'm not sure we have that much to say about it yet, but it is something there you have to think about, right? Once you get deeper, and it's like he said, this is like a problem in terms of trying to understand. And that's why at some level, a focus we've had in other things we've done and work we've done is trying to figure out ways to clean up how information goes up and down the system of an organization, right, military. And that's kind of now going to the next slide of how we possibly think of, and we're just kind of putting it out there, and you guys can tell us what you think about ways to deal with this, in the sense that maybe a possibility of educating upward. And what we mean by that is, and we're not sure, we're kind of, but want to explore it, the idea of at a certain stage, if you're, say, planning and you know these problems are there, the idea that you want to make sure the force, the capabilities are designed for all these range of conflicts. If there's a way in which you can almost be like a bank loan officer, and somehow, and I don't know what level this would be at forgive me for that, but ask the questions about what, kind of how are these capabilities going to, or how is this item going to be used? What are you looking for the use? In what types of conflicts, right? And then a way in which you can compare across all capabilities to understand what capabilities we really have. And what I mean by what types of conflicts, are they trivial conflict, are they, low threat conflicts that have these kind of strange goals, right? Or not strange goals, but, goals that are not particularly military. Or are we going to, are we thinking of the capabilities here in more typical military situations under higher threats that we really care about? The only, we bring we've gone towards this idea of trying to think about solutions only because of other work that we've done in which we've found that some of this stuff can be useful. But it's up for discussion, and we think probably people in the room would know better than us what kind of thing could, even how in which you could possibly account for this.
This is the real weakness of the project, is like is that if you're in a non-existential world, what do you do to help things out? And we're still playing around with this. Like Jason said, we're working on a different type of project with a customer on a different thing in Tampa. And a lot of it also has to do with senior folks not understanding impacts of operations at lower levels and trying to create mechanisms to both like inform and report upwards, but also educate ignorant in the clinical sense, ignorant superiors, in terms of providing tools and frameworks to normalize the discussion between subordinates who may have information asymmetry over their leadership, to try to normalize what they're actually talking about, and guide their choice in a better way, if that makes sense. But it's a more operational customer. But here, this is all spitball. Like this is where we bum everybody out, because the big thing is like you achieve really efficient national security production when you're literally fighting for your life, and otherwise all else you're going to get varying degrees, increasing degrees of inefficiency, particularly if you're a hegemon, right? Or have these like investing all this money in this hegemonic enterprise to police the international system, you should expect grotesque inefficiencies, which is kind of a bummer. So
is that kind of the idea, right? That in theory, if this would be, if you could implement something like this, it would be more efficient? Is that?
This is.
It would be like this idea. The idea is at best case, you could implement something second best, right? Which we'd call not really efficient, but better than trying to do the first best, which is going to always get you something more, right?
So, but if your first best is towards the existential problem, do you really want to take the risk of taking the second best if you're going to risk the existential?
And this is a really good question we talk about a lot, and but the key thing is then that should be that needs to be known, right? The idea is like known in the sense that there's got to be some, or if it's helpful, the idea that the political decisions should be made with but the problem is then there's incentives for the military to kind of misrepresent. They say, I can do everything, right? So this is difficult. There's still finding a mechanism for these things to be known, which I'd say that by this upward, the idea would be trying to say, okay, yeah, we're fine. We should just be planning for existential, not be trying to do, if we decide that, but then by like, say, some kind of, even like this bank loans, then it's clear that's what we planned everything for. So then when you get into something lower, it's like already clear there where it's not a misrepresentation, where there's data that's down, right? It's some kind of way in which, obviously, I don't know how this would actually
a lot of these problems. So a lot of these problems are principal agent problem. Like it's a principal agent problem in economics, where you have a principal that hires an agent or contracts with an agent to do something for them. And usually the agent has specialized knowledge. And in the business world, if you have someone like remodel your bathroom, that plumber who's going to remodel your bathroom is going to give you estimates on how much it's going to cost to get what you want done. And we assume they have specialized knowledge and an incentive to misrepresent themselves, misrepresent the cost, right? They're going to try to inflate the cost as much as they think they can get away with to get extra profit. Now, in that example, what do you as the consumer do? You get 5 estimates from 5 other plumbers and use the market to reduce that one plumber's capacity to hoodwink you into paying more than you need to for your bathroom remodeling. in this is also a principal agent problem, but it becomes much, much more difficult to try to use mechanisms to reduce the information asymmetries and normalize understanding, assuming everyone from the president all the way down to Corporal Snuffy in the Army all share to some degree the interest in the nation and the national security. How do you normalize information and understanding as much as possible throughout that chain? Because a lot of this are information problems, right? And this, you have two problems here that you don't have in the plumber example. One of them is hierarchy, right? This is all the commander. The president is the commander in chief. So a lot of times when things go down, it's yes, sir. Of course, I can go to Afghanistan, take my military forces to make Afghanistan democratic. Whatever military leader said yes to that, what were they thinking, right? They can't do that, right? So one of them is just the fact that a lot of this is hierarchical, that people have to say yes, sir, yes, ma'am, as they point upward. So that's one. And the second one is you don't have these market mechanisms that you have in the private sector where you can use the market to reduce information asymmetries. So the thing is, we're still casting around and thinking, how might we help some of these problems? But I don't think that we certainly don't have any kind of magic bullet to solve this when you're not facing an existential threat. How would you get perfectly efficient national security production? I don't think we can do that.
So backing up for a third, because this is for background, I've been doing this for like 10 years. This particular problem. So the measure, like your plumber example, the measure of how effective the plumber is going to be, it's potentially linked to the how much he's going to charge you. But and you guys talked about it in the measurement of national security, right? But you I was most interested in that and kind of glossed over that a little bit, right? But that is the hardest thing to calculate, right?
Yeah.
How are we achieving our national security and what is that worth to us? And so to calculate that, to me, is the other problem in that depending on where you sit, that can be a potentially varying, vastly different equation and or value.
Yeah.
And then like, how do you relate those things? Like, what's the value of, and this is a literal example, like a schoolhouse versus an F-35.
Right.
Like, which to you is more important?
Right. So this is a great problem. One is, can we even conceive of, conceptually, an ideal amount of national security? This becomes really difficult, under the security dilemma, this becomes really difficult because you can buy a bunch more national security. You can buy some national security and that can be great. You can buy too much national security, which results in arming by other opponents, which then makes you less secure. So the optimal amount of national security is actually endogenous to the threat environment, right? Is that I can be arming, like all those nasty Soviets have a bunch of tanks, so I'm gonna buy a bunch of tanks. And then they buy even more tanks because they see me buying tanks. So we've actually frozen the security dilemma problem where the level of threat is endogenous to our spending.
Right.
Like we talk about that in here, but that's a whole nother can of worms. And then, and when you mean schoolhouse, do you mean a schoolhouse in the United States or building a schoolhouse in Afghanistan? Or
Yeah, like in the States, like
okay, yeah,
military schoolhouse.
right, a guns versus butter problem, right?
Basically,
Yep. And so we talk about that a little bit. That's also, a whole can of worms problem as well. It's funny. I've been reading this old economic historian who Jason's sick of me talking about him. He's from the 50s. Frederick Lane wrote some theoretical work on conceiving of like the optimal amount of what he calls protection, like protection for the nation or protection for productive activity. And he wrote in the 1950s about this, of talking about he's very interesting because he says a lot of economists think that spending on defense is an opportunity cost for the economy. And he says you can't think of it that way because the protection that's afforded by an appropriate level of national security actually needs to be considered as a factor of production for all economic activity. Because if you don't have it, it's insecure. And so he just, yeah. So, yeah, that's right. That's right. So but all these things, when you pull on the thread, like each one of these becomes its own can of crazy worms. But 100% appreciated. This is not an easy thing. Yes, sir?
I was just going to make a couple points since I'm the only bald-headed person in the room. I've been around a long time. But you know, back in quote the old days, the problem was relatively simple. It was a linear problem. The threat did not change much. We had a long time to do analysis, to be thoughtful, to figure out what the gaps were, the threats, what we needed to buy.
Yeah.
And what we needed to do.
Yeah.
And then when we realized that the Soviet Union was not a 10-pound bear and the wall came down, I remember being in an office in OSD on that day when the wall came down and somebody says, we're no longer be able to convince people that they're 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
Okay? So asymmetric warfare came along. And so the world is a lot more complex from a warfare standpoint,
Yeah.
threat standpoint. So the variety of capabilities, forces you need has to be different, right? Has to be more complex.
Right.
So in my mind, you know, there's kind of two aspects of this. One is, what are the capabilities and what do you need to buy? Okay? And then, how do you go about making the decisions as to whether or not you're going to employ them? You know, whether it be an existential threat or whether it be something less than that, which is what we get into all the time.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't think we spend enough time with leaders on how to make that decision. You know, it seems to be like all or nothing.
Right.
You know, let's deploy 3 divisions rather than say, hey, wait a minute, let's think through what it is that we're trying to do and how to do that. So I guess I would kind of urge you to think about this in 2 levels. One is the capability, you know, how to be smarter about what we ought to buy and the level we ought to buy, and then also about, you know, how do you go about making the decisions
That's right.
to employ that capability
That's
to
right.
get the maximum benefit?
Yeah, and that's where we try to get, you know, that educate upward is not the right word, but informing, sort of bettering that decision-making process around understanding your existing capabilities, readiness, whatever the challenge is, and having a more realistic discussion about how they might be employed, threatened or employed, and trying to improve that level of discussion. Because like I said, we're working with a customer in Tampa on a very particular problem set, and people are like, the warfighter in this case, the action elements are like, we don't know what we're doing, but we're proposing things upwards, and we have no idea what we're doing, and we're throwing random ideas up, and people above us are like, we don't know either. Sounds good. Just stay busy. And this is really disconcerting. And we've heard this from a number of customers that we've talked to in a particular area, and it's a couple things, just like in Afghanistan, just like the Comer book from Vietnam was like, you got hard-charging young men and women in uniform, over in places or doing things, and they're told, stay active, do stuff, do something. We don't actually know what we're doing or what the marginal impact is, so just do a lot of it, but just keep doing something. Especially right now, well, I can't get into it, but a lot of these problems are information problems. And it's not that anyone has all the information in the world, but there seems to be information asymmetries and incentives for people to misrepresent themselves. And so normalizing information, understanding incentives problems, particularly when it comes to revealing true estimates of things. Like we did a book on wartime assessment like 5 years ago, and it was an edited book, and we brought in a developmental economist we brought in to write a chapter on developmental economics, and he was going to look at sort of assessing the development of Afghanistan. And he didn't know anything about Afghanistan, never thought about it. We brought him in, had him read. This was like in 2015, the book was published. He read all the stuff that the policy was based on in Afghanistan, and he's like, he was horrified. He's like, has anyone working on this in Afghanistan like read one book on developmental economics? And we went back and looked at the history of it, of all these entities that said, yes, we can do this. Of course, sir, we can do this. Give us bags of money to toss around Afghanistan, you know, in the CERP program, et cetera. And he's like, everything they're doing is contradicts every basic element, every principle of developmental economics. Whoever at whatever point said, yes, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I can do this. We can do this. My guys can do this. They work hard. We can do this. Is insane. And what people at what point are like, develop, before you make commitments, before you invest, before you commit forces, before you get into this, can you form these estimates? Just because you have a lot of F-16s and MRAPs, can you economically develop Afghanistan? Or even roust the Taliban out of the hinterlands? So to your point, and to your point also, bettering those decisions, I think, is really the key. So
You have a note on Teams that says, consider noting the hazards of politicizing messages, for example, climate change. The same type of thing could hamper the national or nationwide need for cybersecurity to harden the USA against coming or starting cyber wars.
well, I do think politicization of information, I think, is critical. In the Assessing War book, we actually had a great scholar of the Vietnam War talk about politicization of the assessments coming back from Vietnam to the light at the end of the tunnel type narrative coming back. So politicization, particularly at the higher levels, I think is a real concern.
You ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, it's 2:46. We are really thankful for you all hanging
good
in
time.
there
Thank you.
to some goofball social scientist
Yeah.
talking a bunch of stuff for 2 hours. It's huge. Thank you for sharing your
Yeah, I
afternoon with
appreciate it.
us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.